Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we are taking a stack of sources that, well, they really challenge some of the most fixed notions we have about ourselves: gender, identity, and sexuality.
We're going to run them through a critical sociological lens. So we're moving beyond just the simple definitions.
Right, into the complex mechanics of how society actually builds and, enforces these categories.
That's it. Our mission for you, the listener, is pretty ambitious. We want to extract the core sociological concepts, everything from how your mind forms an identity to how laws get written.
And connect them to some, frankly, surprising facts and immediate policy implications.
Exactly. We want to show you the architectural blueprints of social identity and do it quickly and thoroughly.
Okay, so let's unpack this. The core premise that seems to guide all of our source material is that the simple binary of man-woman is fundamentally a social construct.
It is. It's a system that's upheld by human institutions, by norms, not some inevitable reflection of how identity really works day to day.
So the idea is that multiple genders and different sexual identities have what always existed.
They have, across cultures and throughout history. The language changes, of course. You have concepts like third gender in various indigenous communities, or the modern understanding of non-binary identity.
But the common perception, that idea of a simple, unchanging male-female opposite,
Is a construct. It's designed to simplify a reality that is, in fact, far more complicated.
and this isn't just an academic discussion. I mean, it has immediate, tangible consequences for millions of people today.
Or absolutely. Here's the real-world hook. You just have to look at the recent ruling in Richmond, Virginia.
The one where a federal judge determined that gender-affirming care is covered under the Americans with Disabilities Act.
That's the one. And that ruling forces a fundamental shift in how the law perceives this. It speaks directly to the profound negative effects, the anguish that transgender people experience.
Because of that disparity between their internal gender identity and the sex they were assigned at birth.
Precisely.
Mm.
And we need to understand the mechanism here. The ruling basically recognized that severe gender dysphoria, that's the medical term for that anguish, is a profound impairment.
An impairment that substantially limits major life activities.
Exactly. And that opens the door for legal protection.
So that legal recognition is crucial because that anguish is precisely what so much hostile legislation seems to be targeting.
It is. I mean, these attempts to block access to medical care, to employment, to state benefits, they're all built on the idea that being transgender is either a choice or a disorder that's not worthy of protection.
And the ADA ruling just directly challenges that premise.
It does. Which brings us to the central policy question we have to grapple with. When these foundational laws, and think about workplace anti-discrimination rules, when they were conceived, did they cover all genders?
Or were they really only thinking about the cisgender binary?
Historically, they were framed around the binary. That was the assumed default. Heterosexuality and cisgender identity were just the unmarked categories.
And the source material has a really stark modern example of what this means in practice.
It does. So if a cisgender woman goes to a clinic for care, no recent bill is trying to deny her that care based on her gender. But a transgender woman,
Under some of these new restrictive state bills, could be denied the exact same care.
right, and it's based entirely on this legislative assumption that her identity is somehow less valid or less protected than her cisgender counterpart.
It just shows you that assuming a binary framework in law isn't neutral. It's actively marginalizing people and denying rights to those who exist outside that very narrow idea.
And this whole deep dive is about the mechanics of how that margin gets created.
So before we dive in, let's just quickly nail down two crucial concepts that are going to anchor this whole discussion.
Good idea. First, gender identity. This is your internal sense of being a man, a woman, both, neither, or somewhere else along that spectrum.
So it's self-defined. It's an internal experience.
Correct. And second, the force that's driving this entire architecture, the social construct.
And this isn't some conspiracy theory. It's an idea, a norm, a value, a role that's been created and accepted by people in a society.
And it's upheld through shared meaning, through roles, institutions, and importantly, it can change.
That sets us up perfectly for part one, how society actually constructs and then internalizes gender.
Right, the mechanism of construction. We start by digging deeper into gender identity beyond just assigned sex. The traditional expectation is, well, someone assigned female at birth identifies as a woman.
And someone assigned male at birth identifies as a man.
We call that being cisgender, when there's an alignment between your assigned sex and your gender identity.
But we have to acknowledge that vast space outside of that alignment, the individuals who don't fit neatly into male or female.
Right, those who might identify as non-binary, they either reject or simply don't feel connected to that rigid, mutually exclusive system.
And to really drive home how arbitrary this whole division is, how the meaning is just manufactured, we have to talk about the classic example.
The shocking history of pink and blue.
It is the perfect, almost unbelievable illustration of how society just invents meaning. If you polled people today, it's a given. Blue's for boys, pink is for girls.
Universally. But if you just rewind about a century, that was completely false.
So the norm we have now, it was only really cemented around the 1940s.
That's right. Before that, sources from 1918 show that the accepted rule was that pink was considered more decided and stronger.
So pink was for boys.
Pink was for boys, and blue was seen as delicate and dainty, and therefore more appropriate for girls.
Just think about the implication of that. The meaning was completely flipped 180 degrees by cultural consensus in just a couple of decades.
And to add another layer of arbitrariness, historically, babies of all genders typically wore white dresses until the 1940s. It was just more practical.
So this proves that the meaning of gender, from the clothes we wear to the colors we use, is entirely made and maintained by society.
Through norms, values, institutional marketing, and that same effort is what actively props up the gender binary.
Okay, so if the binary is just a socially enforced structure, what is the inherent problem with using this simple framework to describe a complex social reality?
Well, the fundamental flaw with any binary, black, white, masculine, feminine, straight, gay, is that they frame their two parts as absolute, unchanging, and mutually exclusive opposites.
They create definition through difference, not coexistence.
Exactly. And that have two very negative social consequences. First, you get these exaggerated differences.
Right. We start relying on simplistic, often harmful comparisons based on stereotypes. This is where we get those tired old tropes.
Men are from Mars, women are from Venus.
Men are practical, women are emotional, as if there's no common ground, which just masks the huge commonality of human experience.
And the second consequence is the active erasure of complexity. Binaries mask the messy realities of human identity.
They define themselves by excluding anyone who bridges or rejects the two poles.
Right. It erases the existence of individuals like multiracial people or people with non-binary gender identities. I mean, men are defined by being not women, and women are defined by being not men, which leaves absolutely no space in the middle.
And this leads us to the critical challenge, the one that really destabilizes the whole binary system. The existence of transgender people.
The transgender challenge is, you could say, existential to the binary argument. Transgender people, individuals who don't identify with the gender they were assigned at birth, they contest that very deeply ingrained argument that biological sex predicts gender identity.
So when a trans man who is assigned female at birth identifies as a man,
Or a trans woman assigned male at birth identifies as a woman, they demonstrate that identity is separate from the physical body's initial classification.
it forces society to separate the internal identity from the biological body.
And that challenges the very idea of a single-sex gender identity. I mean, if gender identity were fixed solely by biology, the trans experience would be impossible.
The fact that it's a profound internal reality just shows the power of that internal identity over any external biological classification.
It pushes identity firmly into the realm of sociology.
Exactly. So if identity isn't fixed, then how is it formed? And that's where sociology provides the roadmap.
Right. Sociologists, unlike psychologists who often look inward at individual thoughts, they look outward. They look at the social context, the norms, the institutions, the interactions, to understand how we develop a sense of self.
So the focus is squarely on the environment, on how we incorporate the attitudes of other people into our own being.
That's the tradition. I mean, thinkers like Durkheim show that even intensely private acts like suicide were actually governed by social causes. Our selfhood is fundamentally social.
So let's start with Charles Cooley's seminal work, The Looking Glass Self. We can think of it as the social mirror.
Cooley argued that our self-understanding is entirely constructed by our perception of how other people see us. We don't just know who we are. We see ourselves reflected in the eyes and reactions of others.
And he broke it down into 3 distinct steps. So step 1 is imagining our appearance to the other person. How do I look? Am I following the script they expect?
Then step 2, imagining that other person's judgment of my appearance. What are they thinking? Do they approve? Do they disapprove?
And then step 3 is the resulting self-feeling. Either pride, if the judgment is positive, or
Mortification, if we perceive disapproval or ridicule. And the connection back to gender, is crucial. How we express our gender is based on the expectation of that social response, and we internalize that response.
So if a little boy is praised for being tough, a masculine trait, and ignored when he shows vulnerability, he internalizes toughness as part of his core self-concept.
Precisely. And building on Cooley's foundation, George Herbert Mead came along with a more detailed sociological approach. He agreed that identity only develops through social interaction.
And he broke the self down into two parts that are in constant conversation with each other, the I and the me.
Right. The me is the public persona. It's the socialized self that recognizes the organized sets of attitudes of others toward you. It's the part of us that knows the rules, knows its role, and anticipates what society expects.
Whereas the I is more spontaneous acting self, the subjective part that takes initiative or responds to those attitudes.
Exactly. And Mead also developed this brilliant set of stages that children go through as they learn to fully embody their gender and internalize social roles. It's critical for understanding socialization.
So the journey starts in the preparatory stage, infancy, basically. Kids are just imitating and copying the people around them.
Right. Parents, family, maybe figures on TV. It's imitation without any real understanding of the meaning behind the action.
Then comes the play stage. This is where they imitate through role play.
Playing house, dressing up as a firefighter or a doctor. The key here is that the roles are fluid and they're isolated. A child plays one role at a time without really grasping how that role fits into a larger social system.
But then they move to the game stage. And this is where it gets crucial for internalizing complex gender norms.
Yes. Here, the child learns to distinguish and understand different roles simultaneously. They see how all those roles interact with one another, and they start following established rules and expectations.
I like the baseball analogy for this. A kid learning to play baseball can't just know the role of the batter.
No, they have to simultaneously understand the role of the pitcher, the catcher, the umpire, and how their own role changes depending on the context of the game.
And in terms of gender, they learn that, say, boys must be competitive, while simultaneously learning that competitive girls are often viewed negatively. They're internalizing contradictory norms based on their perceived social role.
And finally, they reach the generalized other. This is the big one. It's the internalization of the common norms and expectations of the larger society, the collective attitude of the whole community toward them.
So they're now able to internalize how they're viewed, not just by their parents, but by society. And this cements their understanding of their place and the performance required of them, including gender norms.
Right. So we've established that gender is socially constructed and internalized through these stages that teach us how we're supposed to act. Now we can move to the outward action, gender expression.
This is how someone outwardly presents their gender identity through their clothing, their demeanor, makeup, physical practices, behavioral cues.
And this external presentation, which flows directly from that identity formation we just talked about, carries significant real-world consequences, especially in professional settings.
You see these really clear, measurable, gendered differences in self-presentation.
For sure. Studies show men typically present themselves assertively. They speak out more, they interrupt, they maintain constant visual focus, and they physically lean in, take up space.
Whereas women, conversely, are socialized to act more modestly. They build status and connection by laughing, smiling, agreeing, reacting positively.
And the consequence is significant because that assertive presentation style is stereotyped as desirable in men, but it's often penalized when performed by women.
This is a core mechanism of the glass ceiling.
It is. Assertive self-presentation, which is essential for career advancement, is often met with negative labels: bossy, aggressive, unlikable when it comes from a woman. Social reinforcement punishes women for succeeding in a highly valued masculine style.
Let's delve deeper into the construction of masculinity, which the source material defines as a very constraining ideal. The way these norms get enforced starts with something called gender policing.
Gender policing is the act of imposing or enforcing normative gender expressions on someone who's perceived to be, failing to adequately perform the gender associated with their sex.
And it starts incredibly young. It often begins with love, not malice.
That's a really important point. Research found that parents, even those who are very open to non-conforming behavior, expressed distress when their young sons exhibited feminine activities, like wearing pink or nail polish.
And why was that?
The parents often discouraged it, primarily to protect their sons from the social disapproval and ridicule they knew they would face outside the home.
That is a vital point. It highlights how masculinity in a patriarchal system is fundamentally defined in opposition to femininity.
Right. The worst thing you can be as a man is associated with the feminine.
And this fear of the feminine creates what's known as hegemonic masculinity. This is the masculine ideal that's viewed as superior to all other forms of masculinity.
And crucially, superior to any form of femininity. The characteristics emphasized by the dominant culture are a very tight set: independence, aggression, emotional control, competition, physical toughness,
And when that performance is pushed to its limit, we get hypermasculinity.
which glorifies aggression and sexual conquest. You see it everywhere in media action movies, some sports,
What?
video games.
And it's essential to stress men are inherently violent, but this hypermasculine performance acts as a script that normalizes and even expects violence and aggression.
And the suppression of vulnerability. It's presented as a necessary attribute of being a real man.
And all of this relentless pressure to conform creates what we now call toxic masculinity.
This term really captures those damaging cultural pressures that compel men to adhere rigidly to that hegemonic ideal. So men reject anything seen as feminine, they engage in risky behaviors, and they prioritize power and status above their own emotional health.
And psychologists have documented the heavy toll this takes, right?
Absolutely. Higher rates of risk-taking, delaying seeking medical care, suppressed emotional processing. It leads to really negative impacts on both their mental and physical health. The ideal that makes men powerful socially also costs them personally.
What's fascinating is that as society evolves, so do the ways men perform this power. We're seeing the emergence of what the sources call hybrid masculinities.
This is when men with privileged identities, often class-privileged white heterosexual men, co-opt certain traditionally subordinated gender styles.
Like engaging in extensive personal grooming fashion or showing more emotional expressiveness, the whole metrosexual idea.
Yes.
But wait, if these privileged men are adopting styles that were traditionally seen as feminine, doesn't that inherently start to challenge the rigid norms? Doesn't that undermine the patriarchy?
That is the exact question the sources address.
Yeah.
And the answer is complex, but largely no.
No.
Scholars argue that hybrid masculinities often conceal systems of inequality rather than dismantling them. When a privileged man adopts a subordinated style, like a fancy skincare routine, he can define it as a choice, an aesthetic, without facing the systemic disadvantages that women or gay men experience for those same behaviors.
So it's a way for the dominant group to adopt the style of subordination without actually giving up any of their power.
You got it. They incorporate the traits that are now deemed socially acceptable for them, but they use their existing class and race privilege to ensure the performance doesn't cost them any status. They're enhancing their own position, not equalizing the playing field.
They're just diversifying their performance portfolio without challenging the fundamental superiority of the masculine ideal itself.
Precise.
Okay, let's pivot to femininity, the high cost of a lower valued ideal. We saw that boys are heavily policed against feminine traits, but the rules are a bit different for girls.
Right. Women often have more behavioral freedom and are sometimes even rewarded for performing certain masculine traits.
Like being a tomboy. A girl who displays masculine traits, like being aggressive in sports, is generally viewed more positively in childhood than a sissy, a boy displaying feminine traits.
And that's a direct reflection of patriarchal social valuation. Masculinity is the highly valued currency. So a woman who taps into that currency gets a slight reward, whereas a man who gives it up is severely penalized.
But women aren't free from policing. In fact, they have to learn this delicate balancing act to maintain acceptance, which brings us to the feminine apologetic.
This is the expectation that women must continuously balance their interest in traditionally masculine activities or success, like a powerful career or athletic aggression, with a strong, visible feminine performance.
And this is necessary to gain social acceptance and avoid the kind of violent gender policing that would undermine their success.
The classic sociological example is female athletes. If they are aggressively successful in a masculine sport, like rugby or weightlifting, they often go to great lengths off the field to appear hyper-feminine,
Through makeup, fashion, or emphasizing their domestic roles.
to counteract the social threat posed by their competence. A more modern example might be the female CEO who posts relentlessly about her family life or baking on social media. That's often the feminine apologetic in action.
She's publicly balancing that high-level masculine competence with a prescribed feminine warmth to avoid being labeled an ice queen.
Exactly. And this ultimately relates to emphasized femininity, which is the pattern of femininity that gets the most cultural and ideological support.
And this type of femininity is defined around compliance with subordination, accommodation, and catering to the interests and desires of men.
Yes. And the core conflict here is that while this version of femininity has cultural value, it defines roles like mother or wife. The traits associated with it, like passivity or deference, are generally devalued in the dominant public culture. The act of doing femininity often requires women to embody a degree of powerlessness relative to the masculine ideal.
So we've established how identity is formed and performed. Now, let's explore how these interlocking systems affect people in radically different ways and how these ideas are literally inscribed onto our physical bodies. We have to start with intersectionality.
Arguably the most vital concept in modern sociology, articulated by legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw back in 1989. She was trying to explain how gender and race are not isolated traits, but interconnected social situations that produce inequality.
She used that powerful analogy of intersection. If a person is black and a woman, they aren't just facing sexism plus racism.
Right. They are facing a combined form of discrimination that is qualitatively different. If you get hit by a car in an intersection, it's not two separate events, it's one compounded injury.
And the central purpose of intersectionality is to understand how these overlapping categories of identity, race, class, sexuality, gender combine and transform the experience of oppression.
The mechanism affects the most marginalized people, making their oppression greater than the sum of its parts.
Let's look at the case study from our sources, queer youth of color.
For LGBTQIA+ and gender nonconforming students who are also racial minorities, the negative impacts of hostile environments, especially in schools, are exponentially amplified.
So they're facing compounded harassment based on race, sexual orientation, and gender identity, all at the same time.
Yes, creating an environment that severely threatens their mental health and their safety.
And the data paints a pretty chilling picture.
It does. Studies looking at mental health among queer youth found that while all queer youth face challenges, those who identified as Hispanic Latinx and African American Black reported disproportionately higher rates of suicidal ideation.
And that risk was amplified by two factors: low social support and intense chronic school bullying that was targeting their multiple marginalized identities.
The system isn't just failing them in one area, it is compounding failure in three or four. This shows exactly how these interlocking systems of oppression create unique forms of vulnerability that you can't solve by just focusing on one identity category.
Moving from the social dynamics to the physical reality, let's talk about embodied gender. How culture literally shapes and influences the physical form of our bodies.
Embodiment is the process where cultural ideals of gender create expectations for what our bodies should look like. And it's a bidirectional relationship. Meaning, by embodying culturally determined gender roles, the way we sit, walk, gesture, we reinforce those ideals in society. But at the same time, we actively shape our bodies, sometimes through intense effort, to perpetuate those ideals.
And what's really remarkable is that this process actively exaggerates the perceived bodily differences between gender categories.
That's right. Sociologically, we know there is statistically more natural biological variation within the male sex or within the female sex than there is, on average, between them.
But society works very hard to make that difference seem absolute.
And cultures throughout history have inscribed gender onto bodies through some pretty radical physical alterations to meet these ideals. We see historical examples like the thousand-year practice of foot binding in China.
The use of tight neck rings in certain African and Asian cultures to elongate the neck, or the punishingly tight corsets in Western cultures that reshaped the female torso.
Even something as common as high heels. They were initially invented for Persian male butchers to keep their feet out of blood, then adopted by European male nobility to project height and power.
And over time, they completely shifted into a feminine fashion statement defined by fragility and perceived sexual appeal. The body itself is a material that we're constantly writing the cultural script of gender onto.
And in the U.S., that cultural ideal has continuously warped. The ideal female body has become progressively slimmer and younger looking, while the ideal male body has become progressively more massive and muscular.
You can see this perfectly in children's toys. The G.I. Joe doll, reflecting the male ideal, became so disproportionately muscular that if you scaled him up to a real man, he'd be physiologically impossible.
And that contrasts sharply with the constantly slimmer, perpetually youthful Barbie doll, epitomizing an equally unattainable feminine ideal.
This feeds directly into Naomi Wolf's concept of the beauty myth.
Wolf argued that, specifically as women began to gain political and economic power in the 70s and 80s, a violent cultural backlash occurred that weaponized female bodies and beauty as a political tool to maintain control.
So the standard of beauty became not just aspirational, but fundamentally
It
unattainable.
was designed to constantly remind women that no matter their political success, their primary value was still tied to aesthetics. And this fueled consumer culture, increasing rates of eating disorders, plastic surgery. Beauty became a constantly depreciating currency system.
The political application is hard to miss. When Hillary Clinton ran for president, the media spent so much time critiquing her attire, her hair, her perceived warmth.
While her male counterparts had their appearance largely exempted from critique, the focus shifts from a woman's competence to her aesthetics, reinforcing that myth that she must balance power with compliant femininity.
And if we look at plastic surgery trends, the data confirms this pressure. The top 5 invasive surgeries, breast augmentation, liposuction, eyelid surgery, nose reshaping, facelift, they all reflect this pressure cooker.
It's aimed at achieving a hyper-feminine, often Caucasian, and younger look. These trends aren't random. They are material reflections of society's high value placed on specific, exclusionary gender presentations.
And these binary expectations get reinforced even in places dedicated to physical health, which brings us to gym culture. The very architecture of these facilities often structurally reinforces the binary.
The most immediate barrier is the prevalence of gender-segregated changing rooms and toilets. For non-binary and gender-diverse people, these spaces force a choice, which often leads to intense anxiety, scrutiny, and potential confrontation.
It makes just pursuing fitness unnecessarily difficult.
On top of that, the activities themselves are rigidly gendered. There's this persistent, often unconscious idea that women focus on cardio and light toning, while men focus on weightlifting.
And the gym floor is often organized that way. The large free weight sections are male-dominated, and the smaller weights are relegated to the cardio area.
But the bias goes deeper than just organization. It's in the design of the equipment itself. Weight training equipment is frequently designed and scaled for an average male individual.
In terms of seat heights, weight stack accessibility, machine leverage.
Right, which makes it genuinely difficult for shorter people, including many women, shorter men, and non-binary people, to achieve proper range of motion or comfortable form on common machines.
And then there is the explicit gender policing in sports and fitness.
In men's sporting communities, this shows up as hypermasculine slurs like throw like a girl or sexually loaded locker room talk. It reinforces the stereotype that real men are big and strong.
But the women-only spaces are not automatically safe havens from this policing either.
Not at all. While they aim to protect cis women from harassment by men, if a woman or a gender-diverse person with a more masculine appearance enters that space, they can face intense scrutiny, harassment, or even be asked to leave.
It just shows that binary gender norms are so entrenched that they often end up excluding the very people who challenge them, even within supposedly safe spaces.
The enforcement of these arbitrary norms, everywhere from media to gyms, creates expectations that are damaging for everyone.
So to counter this, our source material offers a powerful thought experiment, the Igalia preschool in Sweden.
This school uses neutral terms like friend instead of gendered pronouns like he or she, and eliminates gender-reinforcing toys in play areas. The goal is to challenge the mechanism of socialization from infancy.
To create an environment where a child's identity formation isn't immediately restricted by these external binary expectations.
It brings us back to that advice from author Lisa Bloom. Instead of complimenting a young girl's appearance, which reinforces the beauty myth, we should engage her mind. Ask about her ideas, her favorite book.
The Igalia approach tries to make that mind-focused, gender-neutral engagement the default.
So we're transitioning now from gender identity and expression to sexuality, who a person is attracted to.
And sociologically, we view sexuality not just as a private preference, but as another social construct, a cultural universal whose practices and norms are entirely dependent on time, place, and culture.
That distinction is key. What we view as normal or acceptable in terms of attraction is heavily dependent on our culture's level of acceptance.
A conservative, hostile environment will produce radically different patterns of disclosure and safety than an accepting, liberal one.
And the vocabulary of identity is crucial. Our sources cover the overview of sexual identities, reminding us that identity is self-defined: asexual, bisexual, demisexual, gay, heterosexuality, lesbian, pansexual, queer, same-gender loving.
It's important to note the cultural specificity of some terms there. Same-gender loving, for instance, was coined by Cleo Manigo and is specifically used by some in the Black community who feel that terms like gay or lesbian are too Eurocentric.
Exactly. But while this language is vital for recognition, accurately measuring the non-heterosexual population in the U.S. remains exceptionally difficult.
Why is that? What are the challenges?
The first major challenge is just fluctuating definitions. Identity is fluid. How do you categorize someone who identifies as heterosexual but has deep private relationships with other genders? Or someone who is asexual but identifies as queer? The terms are self-defined and constantly changing.
And the second, more consequential issue is safety and disclosure.
Right. Even in anonymous surveys, many non-heterosexual individuals do not feel safe enough to disclose their identities due to pervasive social norms, fear of discrimination, or outright danger.
Which has led researchers to widely conclude that all our official estimates of the non-heterosexual population are significantly underreported.
The true numbers are likely much, much higher.
Speaking of numbers, the data does show that while the majority of the U.S. identifies as heterosexual, we have seen a definite and persistent increase in non-heterosexual identification in recent years.
Especially among younger generations.
But this is a crucial distinction that sociologists make. This rise is overwhelmingly due to increased social acceptance and visibility, not an actual increase in varied attraction.
Exactly. Non-heterosexual individuals have always existed in these numbers, but historical hostility, enforced by the state and social norms, made it dangerous, sometimes lethally so, to be open about it.
And that historical hostility is fueled by heterosexism.
Which is the discrimination or prejudice based on the assumption that heterosexuality is the only normal sexual orientation. You see this historically through state actions, discrimination in the military, housing, employment, leading up to watershed moments like the Stonewall riots in 1969.
And while legal rights and visibility have increased massively, the risks remain high.
They do. PFO's 2022 data shows that hate crimes based on gender identity actually increased from 0.5% to 1.8% of reported crimes, and sexual orientation still accounts for 18.6% of all reported hate crimes.
So that acceptance is clearly fragile and constantly contested.
You can see the institutional battleground for these norms played out most sharply in sex education in the public school system.
Unlike a country like Sweden, where comprehensive sex ed is universally required, it's not consistently mandated across the U.S., which creates an institutional failure.
And the controversy isn't really whether to teach it, but what type to teach. The debate centers on three models. Abstinence only,
which gets about 15% support. Then there's abstinence plus, which is around 46% support, and teaches abstinence is best, but includes info on protection.
and finally safety and responsibility, which has about 36% support.
But since the 1980s, the focus has often been on that abstinence-only model.
It has. And that model promotes sex strictly as an act between two heterosexual cisgender married people. This curriculum choice is not accidental. It's a political strategy to reinforce that nuclear family ideal.
And it actively ignores, dismisses, or teaches fear regarding same-sex attraction and gender fluidity.
The resulting omission of LGBTQIA+ topics is routine. Less than 4% of LGBTQIA+ youth reported any mention of sexual or gender orientation in their health classes.
And that systemic erasure sends a powerful sociological message.
It implies that sexual and gender fluidity is unnatural or perverse, and it actively violates adolescent human rights by withholding critical health information they need for self-care and safety.
The data connection here is just irrefutable. It speaks directly to public health.
It does. Comprehensive sex education, which affirms LGBTQIA+ youth and provides concrete health information, is strongly correlated with much better public health outcomes.
Lower unintended teen pregnancy, lower STI rates, increased condom use.
Look at the sheer comparison. Sweden, with its comprehensive curriculum, has a teenage birth rate of 5 per 1,000 births. The U.S., burdened by abstinence-only programs, is still at 16.7 per 1,000.
And you can track this at the state level. Mississippi, which relies heavily on abstinence-only programs, has an extremely high teen pregnancy rate, 28 per 1,000.
And it clusters with other states like Arkansas, Louisiana, Oklahoma, and Alabama, which have similar restrictive curricula and similarly high rates. It suggests a direct systemic correlation between curriculum choice and adverse public health outcomes.
Finally, we have to analyze the institutional conflict over marriage equality. This battle is a perfect lens for understanding the power struggle over fundamental societal norms.
All through the perspective of conflict theory.
So, marriage equality was federally legalized only in 2015, but despite strong public support for it in the vast majority of states, its legality is still under political threat.
That possibility demonstrates how intensely dominant groups work to preserve their ideological interests.
So we can analyze this through the lens of conflict theory, which views society as a competition among groups over limited resources, social, political, and economic.
Right, and social and economic institutions, like marriage, are seen as tools used to maintain the dominance of the ruling class.
So for conflict theorists, this debate has two key dimensions, ideologically.
Ideologically, the dominant groups, often those aligned with traditional religious and political institutions, want to maintain their traditional worldview. They see marriage solely between a man and a woman as sacrosanct. That's an ideological resource they're fighting to preserve.
And then there's the economic dimension.
Economically, legal marriage grants critical financial entitlements. Social security benefits, medical insurance for partners, inheritance rights, tax benefits, hospital visitation.
Denying those benefits to same-sex couples is fundamentally denying them access to fundamental social and financial resources. The fight is very much a struggle over who gets to access the economic benefits codified by the state.
And the implication of overturning this decision, especially given the recent shift on abortion laws, is massive. If same-sex marriage legality is returned to the states, couples in those states that vote no would immediately lose all those federal rights and entitlements.
It just emphasizes the deep fragility of recently won equality against deeply institutionalized norms and the power of dominant groups to restrict access to crucial resources.
So we've covered a massive landscape today. We started by establishing that the gender binary is this fragile, enforced social construct, shown by something as arbitrary as the history of pink and blue.
Then we track the precise sociological mechanism of how our selfhood is created through Cooley's looking-glass self and Mead's complex stages of internalization.
And we saw how that identity is performed through gender expression, leading to the destructive pressures of toxic masculinity and the need for the feminine apologetic.
And we witnessed how these systems tragically intersect, disproportionately harming marginalized groups like queer youth of color, and how cultural ideals are literally inscribed onto the body, demanding surgical conformity and even defining the architecture of a place like the gym.
Ultimately, the gender binary is upheld by political institutions, media, and education, often at a significant life-threatening personal cost to those who fall outside of it.
And these institutions, whether it's a clinic denying care or a state challenging marriage rights, they aren't just fighting for tradition. They're fighting to maintain deep-seated power dynamics based on assumptions of heteronormativity and cisgender norms.
Which brings us to our final, provocative thought for you to mull over.
If increased visibility and acceptance of LGBTQIA+ identities cause such an immediate and strong political backlash, what does that ongoing conflict reveal about the true stakes of maintaining social norms? Is the fight genuinely about upholding tradition, the pink and blue of the past?
Or is it fundamentally about protecting the institutionalized power dynamics and the economic privileges of the dominant class who benefit directly from the status quo?
Consider what further seismic shifts in policy and collective perception would truly be necessary to eliminate these systemic inequalities, rather than just legally accommodate those who challenge the binary.
That's it for this deep dive. We hope we've given you the tools to better understand the social structures shaping who we are and what we're allowed to be.
We'll see you next time.